All right. Yes.
Everyone would be kind of like that. Can't take it with you.
I'm Superman.
Idea.
In a very distant respect. All right. So moving on from the sort of church-related liturgical dramas that were being presented up until about the 1500s. Every Man is 1503. Right about this time, the world of Europe is going under a fairly radical change, and England is not an exception from that. So this is really where there's a significant movement going on in Italy. Not quite so much in France, Spain, and the Germany, Prussia area at this time, parts of Western Europe, but because of the scene that's happening, that's starting to develop in England, it's really kind of the primary course because it's what gives us Shakespeare and so forth. So, church started to, its use is dwindling, and this is partly because of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation, of course, brings the doubt into people's minds about the genuine nature of the church and some of its practices. So because of that, what had been a fairly significant stronghold across most of Northern and Western Europe becomes now, there starts to be cracks. And those cracks lead to people questioning their existence a little bit more, kind of like the Greeks did back in the day. So we start to get non-monastic universities, places of study that don't have an emphasis on Christianity or the elements of the religion itself. Most of these universities, their studies are what is known of the Greek and Roman Empire. They're studying the classics, they're studying the procedures, and studying the architecture, as well as things like the notice of law. Okay? It first initially starts out as what we would call an elementary school, probably. These boys' schools that were literally teaching reading and writing to a much more expanded basis. This wasn't public education per se, but it was not just monks and priests that were receiving the education now. The first sort of official secular play that has evidence of being performed at one of these schools or universities was Henry Medwall's Fulgens and Lucrece. And this is, interestingly enough, if you dial back the clock in British history to Henry VII, not Henry VIII, but Henry VII, there was some controversy because he was appointing people who were not of the immediate sort of like court family to positions kind of like his cabinet members. Okay? He was appointing people who had had some university training, who had received some education and deemed themselves worthy of these positions. So it caused some controversy because it violated primogeniture. Anybody know what that means? Antonio?
The succession of the first son.
Exactly. That the kings and or inheritance of every family was automatically passed to the first son. Well, this play, Lucrece, kind of falls in love with somebody who's not of her station and causes all kinds of rifts and ripples. And again, it's a piece that kind of reflects the questioning of the rules that they had to be. Why does this person get to be a ruler or have a place of prominence just because they were born into it? Doesn't necessarily mean they're worthwhile candidate. So this is a premise that is really starting to be questioned quite a bit in the middle of the previous millennium here. Also at the boys' school was a author named Nicholas Udall, who wrote a few plays. Rafe Royster Doyster.
That is the best name I've ever heard.
Isn't it a great name? Was probably his most well-known piece. It was sort of about a braggart warrior who goes around kind of professing how great he is and gets his due comeuppance in the end. This is a comedy. This is performed at boys' schools, meaning there were no girls' schools at this time, meaning that all the parts were played by the students. Gammer Gurton's Needle, which is actually not by Nicholas Udall, is another play that is developed out of a story of a couple of peasants, more of a rural society, battling over a sewing needle that goes missing. Okay? Now, what's significant about these is that they are borrowed plots from Plautus and from Terence. So the study of the classics brings them to these Roman comedic writers who basically borrow their stories. There's no such thing as a copyright law at this time. And so they borrow their stories and place them in more recognizable circumstances within the English society. Okay? So this is taken from Plautus's Braggart Warrior, and this really starts to launch a trend, one that we see carried on and carried through by Shakespeare and several of his contemporaries. Not all of them, but several. One of the other sort of step ladders along the way of performance was around the Christmas Revels, which was typically a several week-long sort of celebration of Christmas at various schools. They had these sort of staging of what they call the Inns at Court. If you ever go to any of the sort of major universities in England, most of them are broken down into colleges, the older ones. And they are centered around several buildings that have a courtyard in between. This kind of makes itself a natural performance area because you have acoustically the buildings to capture the sound. You have several levels at which people can line themselves along the railings looking down on the court and see everything clearly. So one of the primary values and studies at this time is what is the nature of law. Again, this kind of goes in a significant step away from the church law to understand more about what is the human law and what should be considered right and wrong, illegal, legal, and so forth. So these first sort of scripted plays are really law students staging arguments. Okay? But these are scripted. These are not something, these are scripted, these are rehearsed, these are presented for the other students and for some public and so forth at times, particularly a little later on, that really start to come to play. And again, in the course of British history, Henry VIII declares England to be Protestant. That way he can divorce all his wives and so forth and have them beheaded. And there's no problem with the papacy in Rome. But the primary descendant that was left behind from his throne was Mary, Bloody Mary, who is Catholic. So we now have a Catholic back in head of the Church of England, as well as the position of the monarchy. So around this time, one of the most significant arguments that was staged was the Catholic versus Anglican argument. So when Bloody Mary came to rule, basically all form of public performance went away because of the stigmas attached with performers in the Catholic Church. She died, leaving her husband, Philip, from Spain, Catholic Spain, in charge. Therefore, Queen Elizabeth is the next rightful heir to the throne, and the embattlements between Elizabeth and Philip eventually lead to the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the middle of her reign. So, when Elizabeth first came to power, it offered a great deal, we're talking about half a century almost, of relative stability, especially once after the Spanish Armada had been defeated. Okay? So this is a time of big time peace, prosperity, settled society that had time to be able to devote their attentions to pursuits just like in Athens when the Persians were no longer a threat and Sparta had been defeated. Woohoo!
Yay.
Time to explore the nature of who we are. Okay? So that's kind of the conditions that made the rise of theater in England so probable and possible. Now, the first significant, really significant